Teams if you don't have your video on. I've missed you all. So when Wendy reached out to me a few weeks back and said, "Are you interested in doing anything?" It was very easy to say yes to come back and see you all. So I feel like I should preface this with some caveats. So the first is that I'm on sabbatical this semester. So my teaching chops might be a little rusty. I'll do my best to get back in the groove as quickly as I can for you all. Hopefully you'll forgive me any errors or blunders I make along the way. The other caveat is that we're moving a little bit outside of my realm of specialty in terms of what my PhD is in. I am a generalist where I teach, so I teach the entire history of art. So I have taught this stuff quite a bit, but if we have any really in-depth questions, I may have to get back to you on those to answer them, just a warning ahead of time. Many of you have seen me before, and I always bring in way too many images and things to talk about. I've tried to narrow that down a little bit this time around, but I probably will have too many things to talk about just because that's how I roll, unfortunately or fortunately, one or the other. And I'll stop and ask along the way if there's any questions, and I'll try to check um, in the chat. But if I'm somehow overlooking it and you've got a question, please feel free to raise your hand, unmute, and ask me. I like to keep this as casual as we can, since I'm kind of a wacky teacher. I can't keep it straight for very long anyway. So don't feel worried about raising your hand or interrupting if you've got a question or if I'm not being clear about something, because that's always really important to me, is being clear. Okay, let me work on getting the screen share going so we can look at some pretty pictures. It's the way to do it. Mm-hmm.
Hey, Jess, Valerie asked what it's like to be on sabbatical. How do you
Oh,
like?
thank you for bringing that up. I have really enjoyed being on sabbatical. Are you seeing my PowerPoint slide just to double check? I've got two screens going, so I always want to make sure I do it right. Okay. I
Yeah.
really have liked it. I've tried to lean in a little bit into that rest part of sabbatical as much as I can. Um, Probably not enough, but also I don't I'm trying to get my book manuscript finished, the one I've been trying to write for a really long time, and I'm way, way, way behind, but I think that what I've gotten done is pretty solid. So kind of a mixed bag. I am kind of looking forward to the structure of going back, but I don't know. I haven't missed it terribly, I'll be honest. I go back in the spring, so it's wrapping up here. Okay. So I wanted to start by giving you an overview of the things I wanted to talk with you about today. So I wanted to call this the origins of Impressionism. The last time I was doing a lecture, we kind of did a little excursion into the Parthenon and Pantheon, but for the most part, we were talking about Renaissance and Baroque artists. That's really more in my wheelhouse. But then to jump all the way to Impressionism, which really starts in the 1860s and early 1870s, that's a really big distance of time. So I wanted to focus on some of the origins of Impressionism, and then we'll definitely talk about several Impressionist artists. But I thought it was important to give you some context because things have really radically changed in the world of art. And I say world of art, but we're talking about Western Europe primarily. So there's all sorts of other things happening, but for the sort of Western art historical canon, the way we look at this, like the timeline of art history, is things are really focused on Italy in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. But in the later part of the 17th century, see, this part isn't even in my slideshow or my notes, but this is how my brain works. I forgot to include this part. Rome really loses its dominance, its cultural dominance. The papacy gets a little bit weaker throughout the European continent, and so they don't have quite as much power into the later part of the 17th century. And really, it's the French court around Paris that rises to the fore in terms of art. And a lot of that happens under what's known as the French Royal Academy. So this is actually founded by Louis XIV in the late part of the 17th century. It's a way for the king to exert more control over art. This is the Sun King we're talking about, the one who said, "L'état est moi," I am the state. He's this absolutist monarch, and art is a really powerful way for him to communicate his messages. And so the Academy, which I'll get into a little bit more in a moment, they are really the ones running the show about what art is going to be, what art is going to look like, what art is going to be popular. Um, one of the other major points that we will talk about today is that Impressionism is an avant-garde movement. Now, you may have heard that term before, but I want to be clear about what I mean by it. Literally, it's a military term. It refers to the advanced guard of something, like on the front lines. In the art world, what it refers to is something, some group, some person pushing against the standard. And that standard in this case is the French Academy, the Royal Academy. Another thing that we'll talk quite a bit about with Impressionism is the fact that it's incorporating modern technologies and more of a global perspective than we might think of initially. So these last three ideas, the avant-gardeness, the modern technologies, and the global interest, that's not always what people think about first with Impressionism. I know that I, as an undergraduate art history major, I remember really not being very excited to learn about Impressionism. My mom had, water lily prints up in our house. You see the umbrellas with water lilies. I thought, no, it's no big deal. It's just pretty. It's not that cool. Give me something more exciting than that. But then I started learning about it and realizing how trailblazing these artists are. And now it's kind of come to be, in some ways, a sort of normal, especially compared to what comes later in modern art. But what they were doing, when and where they were doing it, was really exciting and quite dramatic. It really made quite an impact. So I want to talk a little bit about. Oops, sorry about that. I went too fast. I scrolled instead of clicked. I want to go through a couple of the artistic movements since the Baroque era before we get to Impressionism. So the next major movement after the Baroque, which you may recall with somebody like Caravaggio, or I think we ended up skipping Bernini. Is that right? Did we end up ditching Bernini last spring? I think we did. Caravaggio is very dramatic and theatrical, and there's sharp contrasts of light and dark. When you think of the Baroque, you might think of over the top, right? That's kind of what that term has come to mean in a lot of ways. The era that comes after that is known as the Rococo. It can also be pronounced Rococo. There's not one correct way to say that. And it is also over the top in some ways, but it's more pastel, it's more lighthearted. It's this art that is made for aristocrats, like it's very much intended for them as an audience. And so it often shows aristocratic concerns. It actually starts as an architectural movement as a way to decorate an interior. So if you see things with like lots of swirly gold things, little ribbon frou-frous, lots of pastel paintings incorporated, mirrors, this is typically a Rococo space. But it comes to become, that's a good phrase, that's fine, an academic standard. So this painting I'm showing you here, Jean-Antoine Watteau's Pilgrimage to Cythera, this was actually Watteau's submission piece to the French Royal Academy. They all had to have a masterwork that they submitted in order to be accepted into the Academy, and this was it. So what we're seeing here is this gathering of aristocrats in their fancy clothing about to embark to the island of Cythera, which is this island sacred to Venus. She's recalled over here in this Hermes statue. Can you see my cursor on it? Okay. This Hermes statue, they've decorated her in flowers. You can see these little cupids here. They're all about to get on this boat and go off into the hazy distance. So it's just sort of light-hearted fare. There's nothing too serious. It often has a sort of kind of silly undertone to it. Every once in a while, you'll have a little darkness, but it's almost never happening. But it's all silly because they shouldn't be romping out in nature in their clothes, right? So this is very much an art for the elite classes, very, very much so. But then after that, let's see if my Delacroix will load. I must be on a transition. Come on, where are you? I don't know why my Delacroix is not showing up. Hopefully that'll show up in a moment. The image I'm showing you that you can see right now by Jacques-Louis David, this work called The Oath of the Horatii, is going to stand in as an example of neoclassicism, which comes after the Rococo, starting in like around 1775, going into about 1850, and Romanticism, which maybe I'll just pop out of my slideshow since this one is being a little bit funny. I know it's a little smaller now. Can you still see my display? Okay, so this painting by Eugene Delacroix will stand in as our Romanticism example. Now, both of these movements are greatly impacted by the Enlightenment. Okay, so just very quickly, in case we're not, or if we don't remember the Enlightenment from our earlier history classes. It's this movement of prioritizing reason. It's sort of like a secular renaissance in a lot of ways. This is in the era of a lot of major philosophers, the development of the scientific method. And it comes to impact a lot of the revolutions that start taking place in the 18th century, starting to find ways to overthrow oppressive administrative states, perhaps most famously in the American Revolution and then also in the French Revolution. And so they look really, really different, and their subject matters are quite different, but they're kind of responding to the same impulse. With neoclassicism, you often have this return to subject matters of the ancient world, usually the Roman Republic, like the painting we're seeing here, where these three sons of Horatio, who's in the center here, they are swearing to die for Rome. They're going to go into 3-on-3 combat with their rivals from the town of Alba in order to save Rome, right? You have this very sort of classicizing background in addition to your subject matter, very stable compositional strategies. All of our groups of people are nicely framed by the architecture. Our poor wilting women over here. It's a much longer story than I'm telling you, but I'm just trying to keep it brief here. But this comes to be prized by the upper classes as well. This painting's actually commissioned by Louis XVI, who will get his head chopped off not too long after that. He actually commissioned this as a way to show how people ought to sacrifice for the state, when in fact they were about to sacrifice him for the state. Poor Louis XVI loses his head. David manages to actually keep his head in the French Revolution. A lot of the people associated with monarchy do not, but David starts working for the Jacobins actually in the Reign of Terror. He sort of becomes their propaganda minister in a lot of ways. Romanticism, you can see the date difference on these two paintings. Romanticism starts a little bit later, but they're both occurring basically at the same time. Now, Romanticism emphasizes some more dramatic subjects and compositions. It also has some orientalizing tendencies, which we can see in this painting called The Death of Sardanapalus. He's this um, I've lost the word for it. Is he a sultan? Is he an emperor? I can't remember right now. And we see him with his harem all about him as he is about to be killed by invaders. So Romanticism is characterized by drama and emotion in much the same way the Baroque is, whereas Neoclassicism is about reason and intellect. So a lot of the Romantic writers and artists see the sterileness of Neoclassicism as leading to these revolutions. Like revolutions, they sound great on paper, but then what do you do once it happens? Like there's a lot of bloodshed. There's a lot of rebuilding of a state. It gets really, really complicated. So these are also styles that are sanctioned by the Academy. So let's see if I can get my slideshow to work properly again now. I want to talk a little bit more about the Academy at this point. So the French Royal Academy has a couple of major jobs it has to do. First, it educates artists. They have to get admitted to it, right? They have to submit a piece and show their talents are what they ought to be. So education of artists is really, really key. Their second major function is to exhibit the works of their members. They do this in an event that's held generally every year called the Salon. It comes to be named for the room it takes place in the Louvre in Paris. So Louis XIV had moved the court out of Paris, rebuilt on a very large scale this hunting lodge known as Versailles. You maybe have heard of Versailles, and that becomes the center of the French court for the next century or so. But the Louvre had been the residence of the kings in Paris. So it's kind of empty to a certain extent. And so the Academy uses it to host their annual salon. And it comes to be named for the room it takes place in. They largely, through these mechanisms, dictate taste. They decide whose work gets shown. They decide what subject matters are most important. And maybe you can kind of tell, even from this view of the 1785 Salon, that it's all about these large-scale, multi-figure compositions that are generally referred to as history painting. That's the top of the list. This is the best of the best. You have to be an educated artist to do this. You have to know your history, and history is used kind of loosely here. Biblical narratives count as history painting. Mythological narratives are history painting. Anything that's multi-figure telling a big story, right? You have to know how to paint a lot of figures and compose them on a large scale. It's not easy to make these massive paintings that are displayed here. To a lesser extent, you have portraiture, landscape, still life. Like these are all lesser genres according to the Academy. Okay. Any questions at this point? Anything I've said but haven't quite made clear? Everybody good? Okay. The one thing that I haven't talked about yet that's happening in the early 19th century, as well as the development of photography. Photography dramatically changes art. So you get these announcements of two simultaneous yet very different photographic processes in the year 1839. The first is by this Frenchman named Daguerre, whose name is on the slide right here. He names his process for himself. It's known as a daguerreotype. His is about the exposure of light on a chemically treated plate that then has to latently develop. Whereas the almost simultaneous announcement that comes out of England by a man named William Henry Fox Talbot, that one's known as a calotype. And although it is not as popular immediately, it becomes the foundation of photographs through the negative process. How many of you remember 35 millimeter cameras where we had film, we had to take it to get developed, and it always came back with those little negatives, right? That you could print more prints from. That's essentially, that comes out of the calotype process. So at first, Daguerre takes hold. I'm going to get into too much depth here. Part of it is the way that France's political system works and the way that they prize inventions versus the way that the British government does it. So that's one reason Daguerre's is able to spread, whereas Talbot's is kept under like a tight patent for a long time. Anyway, once photography develops, there is this kind of tension between it and its two-dimensional counterpart painting, right? Because they may be doing the same thing, but what if photographers aren't really, are they more scientific because of the chemical processes they're dealing with? So an image like Daguerre's The Artist Studio is making an argument actually for why photography should be considered like painting. It's actually borrowing like Dutch still life compositional strategies, bringing in objects that will offer interesting textures and tonal contrast, because photography is all about that value contrast of light and dark. I mean, photography literally means writing with light. So especially when it's only in black and white, you have to think about tonal variation. Photography really comes to impact all art of the 19th century. So we are now officially kind of merging into the era known as modernism. Okay, I'm going to do that mean teacher thing where I start to call on the class. And you can unmute if you would like to answer this or type this in the chat. Like, what is it? How do we define modernism? Like, what happens? What's the catalyst for moving into an era that we would call modernism in the early to mid 19th century? Ooh, I see a hand. Yes, David.
Basically, what happened was the invention of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
had that coming on, which became like new subject matter for artists and painters. So that's where artists kind of started going back and like being objective and looking at real life as opposed to Watteau, fantasy life,
Mm-hmm.
rich. And they were looking at real people and real situations.
Fabulous. Yeah, that's exactly it. The Industrial Revolution is so pivotal to, I mean, it's just such a catalyst for such rapid change, right? It's not only inventions and mass production, it also radically changes the socio-political landscape, because a lot of the poorer populations in the preceding eras, they lived in the rural areas working in agriculture. But with the development of with all this industrialization that goes on, you have a lot of people of the lower classes put out of work out in the countryside with industrialized mechanized farming, and they start moving into urban centers, which actually causes a lot of class conflict. So one of the movements that people will often refer to as being the first modern movement is realism. And can you see the caption on the bottom here, or is it blocked for you? Just in case you can't see it, it's by an artist named Gustave Courbet. And it's a very famous work known as the Stonebreakers. Now, unfortunately, this work was destroyed in World War II. So anytime I see color versions of it, I feel like I have to give this caveat that like we didn't have great color photography back before it was destroyed. So there's probably some variation with what the color initially would have looked like. But Courbet does this really fascinating thing where he wants to be accepted by the Academy, but he wants to do things really differently than them. He creates this work, The Stonebreakers, on the scale of a history painting. So this work was, let's see if I can find this in my notes, the exact, it was over 5 feet by 8 feet, which is the scale of something like Jacques-Louis David's The Oath of the Horatii. But instead of this lofty subject matter, we have this thing that the aristocrats don't really want to be looking at or thinking about, right? Often these upper social classes don't want to think about whose backs they're on in order to live the life that they have, right? So what we're looking at here are these two men who remain fairly anonymous, actually, right? He's turned their faces away from us. All we can know about them is that one of them is younger, one of them seems older. We can tell they're poor by the state of their clothing, right? They've got like a cook pot over here, some other things that they might make their lunch in, but they are doing some of the most menial labor out there. They are chopping up or hacking at larger stones in order to make gravel. And this gravel has a really specific function, and that is to build roads into urban centers. So through these, what seems like a simple subject matter, he's actually talking about really big social issues. He's also, it's hard to tell again from the reproductions here, but he's using a rougher brush stroke, not as well blended as what the Academy likes. So this is not well accepted by the academic model. He actually defines his own work. He identifies it as realist when he debuts several of his paintings in 1855 at a show he held called the Pavilion of Realism. He decided he didn't want his work to be associated with the Academy, that he wanted to do his own thing. Now, realism can take a variety of modes. This I'm showing at the top here another work by Courbet, just to give you a different sense of subject matter. This one, very famous work, huge scale. It's a work called The Burial at Ornans. So if you've been to Paris or are going to Paris, this is in the Orsay. Actually, both of these paintings are in the Orsay in Paris. But this was this work that was seen as like, why do we care about these people? Why do we care about these ex-urbanites? Like they live out in further out from the suburbs of Paris. This is actually where Courbet grew up. You've got this open cavity, this grave right there. It's showing this diversity of classes to an extent, and figural types here, and just the sort of the piety that goes alongside with the burial. Now, I'm showing that in really stark contrast to another artist whose work is often described as realist, and that's Edouard Manet. Manet is kind of a tricky artist to categorize because he works in a sort of realist mode, and I'll try to explain that a little bit better in just a moment with this work. But sometimes he also works in a kind of impressionistic mode. So it kind of depends on the time frame and who he's hanging out with. So he has a couple of really, really famous works, one of which I'm showing you here called Olympia. This work dates to 1863. And it's actually in a long line. Oh, there, my captions are there. A long line of reclining female nudes from art history. Like this becomes a subject matter that's shown over and over and over, starting the late 15th century to now. But people did not like this painting at all. They did not like its the way in which it was painted. She's got these really flat white patches formulating like her whole body. There's a lot of paint that's not really highly refined, that if you look at it up close, it just gets like really blotchy. They also didn't like how assertive her stare is, because Olympia is very clearly a sex worker here. She is not a courtesan. Do I have another view? Good. Okay, so Manet is actually quoting very specifically a painting by Titian, a Venetian painter of the 16th century. This one's called the Venus of Urbino. It probably depicts the Duke of Urbino's mistress, but by calling it a Venus, it's a good excuse to show this reclining female nude, right? Now, she also looks at us, but she does it with a sort of passive look to us. Whereas Olympia, which is a common prostitute's name in the 19th century, she is staring right back at us. She's assertive, right? She is not a passive recipient of anybody looking at her. He also utilized a known model. He also makes a number of other changes that I just don't have time to go into in this painting. we could spend like a whole day on Manet. But we shouldn't do that for a time's sake. But Olympia, common prostitute's name, a recognizable model, like for the audience of this kind of picture, they would have recognized their own sort of leisure pursuits in this. I'm talking about the bourgeoisie and the aristocrats, right? Because that's generally your salon audience. Now, in 1863, so many works of art were rejected from the official salon that Napoleon III, who was in power in France at that time, decided to hold what was called the Salon des Refusés, the Salon of the Refused Painting. So everybody who submitted something that got rejected got to show. This was the most notorious picture. One of the benefits that I didn't mention of the Industrial Revolution, I talked about like a lot of the problems of it, but one of the benefits is it gave people more leisure time, especially if they lived in an urban center. There was like a day off. And so leisure, which is going to be a subject matter the Impressionists are interested in, that also includes things like visiting somebody like Olympia. And the viewers did not like that thrown in their face at all. There's all sorts of good surviving responses to Olympia about how like awful this painting was. And yet it is like one of these most important paintings of art history because of the impact that it made. So just to give you an example of some academically sanctioned nudes, Alexander Cabanel's Birth of Venus, this actually won like the gold medal of the sanctioned salon of 1863. Absolutely perfect reclining female nude, A+, 10 out of 10, highly recommend. Look at that, like softly modeled flesh of the Venus. She's not staring at us. We've got these little pooty figures showing her as Venus. Even in Eng's case, if you've ever wondered how to say this artist's name, it's sort of Eng, French, forgetting a whole bunch of letters. In this case, we have another sort of orientalizing view. This odalisque is this woman in a harem. Okay. So she is also like our purview as the viewer here. You have to think about who the major viewers are of art in this time. They're not thinking about women. They're not thinking about any marginalized people. They're thinking about a male viewer pretty much all the time. This is a perfectly decorous way to show the nude female form. And I think having this contrast shows you a little bit better like how striking Manet's was. Like, okay, we can talk about Venuses, we can talk about women in harems, but we cannot talk about Parisian prostitutes, right? That's inappropriate to show in our faces. Different kind of strategy than Courbet, but at the same time, it's also reacting against the academic standards. So that brings us to the 1870s and this movement of Impressionism. How are we feeling about the preceding stuff? Any questions, clarifications, or comments from anyone? Yeah, David, you're on my screen too. So if anybody else is raising your hand, please make yourself known to me too.
Before you were talking about Baroque,
Mm-hmm.
between that and Renaissance,
Mm-hmm.
was there like periods missing between Renaissance and Baroque, or did it go from Renaissance to Baroque?
Yeah, you can make an argument for a sort of subcategory of the Renaissance called mannerism. And again, I'm sticking over in Western Europe here, primarily Italy and France is kind of the area I'm thinking about. But really they kind of merge into one another. The Renaissance goes for a very long time. The Baroque is a little bit shorter. But these are the major ones that are kind of taking hold in this era.
Okay, I was just missing that one part.
Yeah. Mannerism, a lot of people will say that there is this is kind of old art history. There's a decline in art after Raphael dies. So about after 1520, artists kind of do weird things where they stop trying to represent real life perfectly and instead try to show their sort of artfulness. I almost want to show you an image to show you what I'm talking about, because I think it'll make more sense if I let me think of, yeah, we'll do the Pontormo deposition. That makes the most sense to me. It's kind of hard to categorize one strain of mannerism. So I'm going to just use this image, which hopefully will come up quickly. And if let's get you nice and big. Oh, of course, it's going to be as little as possible. Hold on. We go to the link. Thank you, Wikipedia. Now this color, I'm not as happy with the color in the Wikipedia image as some of the other ones, but mannerism often has sort of strangenesses to it, like the color composition, like the fact that everybody's sort of vertically stacked. Like, are they on some very slanted hill? Why is this man crouching like this? Right? Like that some of the bodily positions are awkward and strange. There have been some art historians who've tried to figure out whose hand is whose in this center area right here. There's just a lot of odd things that get you looking longer. And it's almost like this art for the elite classes who know a lot of other art, because there's also like quotations from famous works of art that are brought into Mannerist works. Some see it as a decline. Others see it as like this new thing. So I think current states of art history wanted to see it as its own new thing. Probably a longer answer than I needed to give. Any other questions before I move on to our Impressionist stuff? Good. Okay. So let's get back into this. Now, I don't know if any of you had a chance to read the website that I sent out that Wendy was supposed to send to everybody, that was about the first Impressionist exhibition and the sort of satirical review of it. So like Courbet and realists, the Impressionists decide that they are going to have their own exhibition. Many of them had belonged to the Academy, but they weren't getting recognition for the kind of work that they wanted to do. Now, a lot of art historians will characterize Impressionism rather than realism as like the first modern painting style, mostly due to its greater treatment of modern subject matters. So, for example, if we're looking at Monet's Impression Sunrise, this is actually the painting that the movement gets named for. They didn't call themselves that. They called themselves the Corporation of Artists, Painters, Sculptors, and Engravers when they exhibited in their first Impressionist exhibition in 1874. In this work, we've got a landscape, a sort of seascape painting, right? You can see the boats on the water here, but then you can also see all sorts of industrialized aspects to this harbor scene, right? We've got these, I always like some sort of crane machine over here, very hazily rendered over to the right. And then we've got these smokestacks over in the left background, showing just how industrialized this harbor is. I mean, without those, there's nothing really giving this particular time, right? Otherwise, it could have been a scene of a large scale ship and then some smaller boats on the water at any time. Really, ultimately, Impressionism is a very diverse movement. And so I'm going to show you a few different artists today. And I hope one of the things that you'll take away from it is they definitely have things bringing them together, but they're each kind of exploring similar things in their own way. Some of the major characteristics of the style is that these are artists who are really interested in empirical observation. So observing from life and trying to translate what they saw without the filtering that the brain does. So if we think about vision, right, we think about our eyes being the thing that sees, but really it's our brain that does all of the work, right? Our optic nerves are vital to our seeing because otherwise the lenses of our eyes cannot make sense of the picture. It's upside down, right? I mean, even if you kind of like look over to the side or something, or even if you're looking at the computer screen, aren't things all sorts of blurry out here in our peripheral vision? That's really how we see things. And Impressionists wanted to try to capture the sort of purity of a view without all the processing that goes into it. They very frequently avoided concrete illusionism. So what I mean by that is, actually, let me see what my next slide is. Let me go, actually, I'm gonna jump forward a little bit. I'm giving away all my secrets. Here, come here. So if we're looking at this one, so this contrast, which I should have had next instead of way down in my slideshow, William Adolphe Bouguereau is an academic artist, right? He is one of the best in the Academy. He's one of the favored ones in the Academy, and he's working with these classicizing subject matters, nymphs and a satyr. He's got this smooth brushstroke, right? This illusionism, like we're looking through a window into our world, right? A lot of painters start realizing like we've got photography to record the world around us. Let's see what painting can do instead. It really liberates painters in a lot of ways from having to render the world as we see it, and instead to try to render it in a way that an artist sees it. I'm hoping that distinction makes some sense, right? They very frequently use pure color rather than blending color. They also frequently paint what's known as en plein air, and I'm going to put that French term in the chat. A lot of people, I don't know how many of art majors we've got out there, but you maybe took a plein air painting class. I struggle really hard to say it without the French terminology, but what that means is taking your stuff and painting outside. This could not happen until the invention of the paint tube, actually. That occurs in 1841. And prior to that, like it's just too much stuff and too much unstable material to pack up all your stuff after you've mixed up your oil paints in the studio and take them outside with you. So frequently what we have with Impressionist painters is them working outside, not just doing a sketch in oil or pastel or, you know, whatever medium that we think of as a sketch, and then going back to their studio and fixing it up. And that's exactly how the Academy responded, actually. They're like, well, this is nice, but you need to go back and finish the painting, right? This is not complete. Frequently, we have subject matters of genre scenes, so scenes of everyday life, scenes of entertainment, landscapes, cityscapes, and scenes of modern industry. Let me go back several slides now. So I wanted to also bring in this comparison to show you some other 19th century approaches to a landscape, or with a waterscape in two of our cases. I apologize that I don't have a label on this one. This is a painting by Monet, actually showing this little island out in the Seine River that several of the Impressionists paint. This is an example of leisure time that the Industrial Revolution allowed for. People could go out and, you know, get on the train and go a little ways out of the city and spend their day at one of these islands or these restaurants that is on the river. So remember, Courbet is our realist over here from 1864, and Théodore Rousseau, whose work I'm showing you here, comes from a group of painters known as the Barbizon School. They do a lot of landscapes. They also paint en plein air, but look how much more finished it looks compared to the Impressionists' work, right? So Rousseau would have been fairly academically accepted. Courbet, you're moving away from it, and then Monet, absolutely not. Like, this is just not finished at all. So ultimately, there's no definitive list of Impressionist artists. Over the course of about 7 or 8 years, they have 8 different Impressionist exhibitions. Almost nobody exhibits at all of them. The first show had about 30 people. Over the course of the 8 exhibits, there's 57 different artists who present their work, including some people that are better categorized today as post-Impressionists. So in my next session, is that next week? I think it's next week. We're talking about post-Impressionism, and we'll talk then about Cézanne and Gauguin, who both exhibited with the Impressionists as well. But they take things from Impressionism and turn it into something else, and that's really more of their mature style or their mature careers. So I also wanted to show you this view, this work by Monet called the Boulevard des Capucines, which is actually in the Kansas City Museum, Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. So I always like showing that because that's where I'm located. And just to give you a sense of the difference of a landscape view with the Dutch landscape, well, he's not only a landscape painter, but the Dutch painter Vermeer with his view of Delft versus the way that Monet is looking at this remade city of Paris. I don't know how many of you have been to Paris. It's this very well unified city. Any of these major boulevards in the older part of the city, they all get redone in the 1860s by this superintendent of the city named Georges Haussmann. I'm putting his name in the chat as well. This is actually referred to as the Haussmannization of Paris because is it still Napoleon III? I think it's Napoleon III still who commissions him to redo the city. So they demolish thousands of buildings, tear down all of the little medieval roadways, and make these big wide boulevards. It makes it into a very beautiful city, but it actually has a kind of negative undertone to it. Do you know how today the French are like really happy to protest about anything? You know, like the yellow vest movement that's emerged in the last several years, or like when Macron last year or earlier this year wanted to raise the retirement age, huge strikes across France. Like they are happy to protest all the time. Well, in the 19th century, there are all these mini revolutions that happen, right? All of these little uprisings in the city. And one of the things that some of these uprisings do, like in the 1840s, is they blockade streets so that the civic guard can't get through. And so one of the reasons that the city gets totally redone, this Haussmannization of Paris, is so that militaries, like people can move through the streets and put down rebellions. So it makes this really beautiful city. So looking at this, one of the reasons I'm telling you all of this is because we might look at a view like this and not think of it as something showing modern life, but it absolutely is. It's showing these dramatic changes to the city of Paris. You've got all these carriages in the streets. You've got all of these people moving through the boulevard in wintertime. Monet is really good at catching the sort of atmospheric quality of his scenes. And I think that leads me to my next images. We'll come back to this idea in a moment. Notice the weird perspective that Monet is showing us, right? You see how tilted up the ground is? That is very unlike compositional strategies we've seen in some time. That is not the slide I thought I had next. Join me as I go through my slideshow. The other major aspect of Monet's work that I wanted to talk about, and some other Impressionists do this as well, is Monet becomes really interested in making these series of paintings. So one of the things that preoccupies him is Rouen Cathedral. So this is one of these major Gothic churches that is a little ways outside of Paris. And he's showing the west facade. So this is the main entrance of one of these Gothic churches. He starts studying this church, this facade, at different times of day in different atmospheric conditions. And he comes up with all of these different views of the same subject matter, trying to do that empirical observation. And instead of trying to refine it and create this illusion of this place, to make it this perfected view, trying to demonstrate what it's like to be in a particular place at a particular time, right? I hate to keep using the word impression, but the fact that like this is just a momentary glimpse, that's something that's going to fade away very quickly. You can see he occupies generally the same place when he's composing these. And again, at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, there's a room there with like dozens of Monet paintings, and they have like 5 or 6 of these Rouen cathedrals. So you can see all of this different preoccupation with this. David, yeah, is your hand up again?
I've seen it before.
Yeah, and it's amazing. And I mean, so he varies composition just a little bit, right? Like it's not perfectly the same way. It's not like setting it up on a tripod or something and taking a photograph. It's studying it from slightly different vantage points, but always with that really light brush stroke. Now, if you were to see these in person, you can see the thick buildup of paint on the surfaces of these. And he does kind of gradually go blind. And so his later career things are these thick globs of paint on the surface of the canvases that he's doing. Let me run back to look at Renoir, who I passed over just a moment ago. So Auguste Renoir, I'm sorry, I'm not putting first names on here. He is of this same generation of painters, exhibits with the Impressionists repeatedly. One thing that he is really occupied by are these scenes of lower middle class and even into the bourgeoisie at leisure. So the view here is of a dance hall and like nightclub at night called the Moulin de la Galette. This is in the neighborhood of Montmartre in Paris, which is this, even back in the 19th century, like an artist colony. It still is today. It's a very bohemian scene, but these dance halls are where people come and spend a lot of their leisure time. They join with friends, they dance, they listen to music. You can see the bandstand in the background. And with this work, I love showing this one because there is like a delicacy to it and almost like it's verging on the like froofiness of Impressionism that sometimes I kind of turn my pretentious nose up at. But I mean, I think you can get a real sense of liveliness here. You can get this real multi-sensory quality to it. I mean, it's almost like you can hear them, hear the band over here in the bandstand. You can see these figures twirling. And a lot of that is through the way that he just sort of captures, through these light brush strokes, facial features, the way that the light moves through the branches of the trees. Can't you get a sense that there is like a tree branch overhanging this group of people, even though we can't see it at all? Like this man's jacket, it is not spotted. It did not have an encounter with bleach. That's not what's going on here. It's this dappling of light, right? You can see it across the surface of this woman too. And again, it's this moment that's going to disappear in just a second, right? Time is fleeting. And yet, so often with the Impressionists, this notion that time is fleeting is not like a memento mori, like it's not a reminder of death. It's like a reminder to take the joy of these moments. There's not really any dark undercurrents to most impressionistic renderings of modern life. Okay, I better keep moving for time's sake because you know how I am. Just to contrast really quickly with the Rococo version of this, right? This is pure aristocracy. It's mythology all combined into one. This is modern life, right? Not us going and prancing in the wilderness and somebody else is going to clean up our clothes. We're going to have fun. We're going to enjoy a beverage and we're going to go dancing. Sounds pretty nice. Leisure time, right? Here we go. I also wanted to talk about Edgar Degas, another one of these very famous impressionists. I've got two more major artists I want to talk about. Degas, his most famous works tend to be those depicting the ballerinas of the opera. So the opera is one of these buildings that gets constructed in Paris at the time of the Haussmannization of Paris. A whole bunch of these boulevards converge there. And they play lots of operas, of course, but they also have a significant ballet company. Now, people from any social class these days can be ballerinas, right? But in this era, this is a time when it's only girls of lower social classes who are permitted to be ballerinas because of how scantily clad they are, right? Upper class women, aristocrats, the bourgeoisie, this is completely inappropriate for them. And so often, even though he's very preoccupied with this idea of bodies moving through space, he's also really interested in studying this class juxtaposition. It gets a little creepy, I'm going to be honest. So like these guys lounging in the background, these are almost certainly patrons of these young girls who, I mean, they're poor, right? They have no financial means to pay for ballet lessons, to pay for their ballet costumes. So they often get sort of sponsored by these upper class men who then they are often kind of sexually available to. It's not a thing for women of the upper classes, right? But this is something that more frequently happens in the lower ones. One of the reasons I brought this in, aside from just showing you how Degas is interested in dancing, because he loves the body in motion, he also loves this contrast of the elegant forms of the ballet compared to those who are at rest. So you see both sides of this quite frequently. With Degas, we see very strong interest in photography and how it's impacting the way painters are thinking. So, for example, we can see this in two major ways in this painting. The first is the fact that we've got these scrolls in the foreground here. Can we recognize what those are? Where are my music teachers? We've got the tops of either cellos or upright basses, right? Yeah, sticking into the composition, which kind of gives us a sense of where our position as a viewers. We're probably just off stage in a box. We can see some of the orchestra pit. There's no reason to include that, right? Except that in a photograph, if you take that, sometimes you capture things you didn't mean to. A painter can take anything like that out. The other major way we see that in this painting is look at the cropping. There's no reason to slice this ballerina like a third off of the canvas. He's doing that to demonstrate how photography has kind of merged into the thinking of painters at this point in time. Here's another example of his ballerinas, this time a little bit more contrast between those at rest and those in an active state. He also is really interested in horses and jockeys. I didn't bring this image in, but are you all familiar with Edward Muybridge's studies, photographic studies? The most famous one is where he's trying to answer this question of if when a horse is galloping, if all of its hooves come off the ground at the same time. Very, very famous image. And through photography, through this tripping mechanism of the wires that he sets up for this horse to set off, this whole series of cameras, he concludes, because the human eye can't see it, he concludes through photography that they are able to do that. So Degas becomes really interested in these photographic studies. And to see these jockeys before the start, like that pole is ridiculous, right? There's no need for that, but it is this showing of photography impacting the way he's thinking about composition. Now, I feel like I need to say this, especially for any art teachers who are teaching photography or thinking about photography, or even for those of you not. Photography is not as simple as it looks. Right? It is absolutely a an artistic medium that takes a lot of setup, a lot of thinking about composition. Sure, we can have accidental shots, but we should not think of photographers as just clicking a button. There's so much more that goes into it. And this is a way to kind of demonstrate how the two feed each other. There's a lot of back and forth between painting and photography in this era. A lot of painters are using photographs instead of studying from the live model at this point in time too. Often they will photograph models and then use those photographs to kind of arrange composition rather than doing the traditional method of drawing. So photography, this is a major, major feature that underpins a lot of Impressionists, not just Degas, but he's the best example I'm showing you today. And then let's see what I have next. Yes, I wanted to start talking about the other source of inspiration. I don't like the word influence very much. If you were with me in Louisville, nope, Lexington, a summer and a half ago, I can't, time is a loop. I don't know when that was. I probably said then that I don't really like the word influence. It's too passive. It only implies one direction sort of things going on, and things are more complicated than that. But there's absolutely an interest of 19th century artists, and we see it especially in the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, in Japanese woodblock prints. So I don't know how much of the history of Japan you know about, but in I have it in my notes, 1853, that's when you have Commodore Perry basically forcing open the ports of Japan. Japan had been isolated since the early 17th century. Like, they allowed missionaries in for a while, and then they're like, no thanks, we're not interested in anything from the West. And then finally in 1853, especially the American interest of wanting different kinds of trade partners and more ports of trade, Commodore Perry and others force open Japan. One of the things that becomes a major export are Japanese woodblock prints. They are mass produced, they are cheap, they're easy to travel. I mean, these are all the basic benefits of printmaking. And we see the impact of them on Impressionists through these kind of slanting compositions, sort of diagonal recess, through the sort of flattening out of spaces. Have you noticed how little depth there are to some of these images I'm showing you? We started seeing it with Manet in the background of Olympia. Like, you just have kind of some sketchy brush strokes, or like a big flat wall of color. Like, that presses forward. It doesn't recede. I mean, cool colors recede more than warm colors, but like this, it's kind of preventing recession into space, which is so much of what painters have wanted for so many years or so many centuries at this point. I think I brought in a couple of other images to demonstrate this. You've got this one by Hiroshige. A lot of these come from this tradition of Japanese woodblock printing called the ukiyo-e, which means the pictures of the floating world. They're showing scenes from everyday life. It's not just the aristocrats. It's not just presenting book illustrations or anything like that. It's the sort of ephemeral floating world. I think I have a few more. Here's another example by Hiroshige. Another by Hiroshige. I see the sort of bird's eye view for this one from Harunobu. Yeah, so all of these different kind of patterning interests. I mean, look at the way the pattern is rendered on these fabrics. We can see this also in the work. Hold on, I'll come back to this just because I want to finish this thought. We can start seeing some of this in the work of Mary Cassatt. Let me go back to the previous slide for just a second and show you this. Now, I have never been to Giverny. It's one of these day trips outside of Paris that I've never made it to, so maybe some of you have been there. But I found this image online and wanted to show it to you, how we see these Impressionist artists collecting these objects. I mean, this is a time when there's a greater interest in this. I've already talked about Orientalizing with Romanticism, but in the 19th century, you get this movement that's referred to often as Japonisme. We use the French term for that. It's just like Japanism, like we don't have a good word for that in English, but you have a critic who coins this term because of the strong interest in the Japanese woodblock print tradition. Eventually, if we get to come to talk about artists like Picasso, I'll talk more about collecting practices of this sort of Eastern or other cultures. I did want to include Mary Cassatt as well, because there are women Impressionists. Now, Mary Cassatt and Berthe Morisot are probably the most famous ones. Morisot is actually married to Manet's brother, so she has a lot of artistic connections there. Mary Cassatt is an American who eventually spends a great deal of time in Paris. She kind of wanders about freely there during the second half of the 19th century. But the thing is, like I just said, I read that out of my notes, and I realized I said the absolute wrong thing. Men are allowed to wander about freely in the second half of 19th century Paris. If women want to maintain a certain reputation, which is really important to any social advancement or any economic building at all, they have to remain quite socially reticent. So what we see in the work of Mary Cassatt and Berthe Morisot is a lot of domestic scenes. They paint what they have a lot of exposure to. So this is a really famous, work, too much scrolling, famous work by Cassatt known as The Bath, where we see this really tender and intimate domestic scene from everyday life, a genre scene, where this is probably the mother of this child rather than like a nurse or something, just based on like the things in the painting is not showing them of a super high social class. But you see the way their bodies press into one another. You see the way the mother's cupping the foot of it. So this domestic image is really characteristic of Cassatt's work. It's really difficult for women to have access to the resources to create something like a history painting. So that's why you don't get a lot of women like in the academy, even for a very long time. There are still a lot of the flattening effects and the sharp kind of rise of the background that you get from Japanese woodblock prints. Like, look at the background. The wallpaper is hardly differentiated than from this dresser in the background or the rug on the carpet. They all kind of get flattened in their depiction, right? So it shows that she is looking towards some of these experimentations that other impressionists are. And she really shares this passion for the Japanese prints like Monet and like Degas. So I'm pretty much at time at this point. So I realize I didn't get to talk much about that reading I assigned to you. I did bring in one more image to show you a couple of the things they were very critical of, but I'm very happy to take a few minutes to answer questions if anybody has them, or any comments, anything I didn't cover that you're interested in.
Are the haystacks like in Chicago part of like the Impressionism or post-Impressionism period?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm pretty sure those are Monet's haystacks, and he does the same kind of thing with a series of haystacks that he does with Rouen Cathedral. He becomes really preoccupied with showing those in snow and evening light, right? Yeah. The Art Institute in Chicago has a fabulous 19th century collection, probably the best in the US. So that's not too far away from you Kentuckians. Is that what people from Kentucky are called? Kentuckians? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. I got scared. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Yeah, the Art Institute actually has oh, that's right. You went there this summer as a group, right? Do you remember that big there's a painting I usually like to teach with Impressionism. That's Caillebott's Paris Street Rainy Day. Very large scale painting.
Yeah.
Another one that doesn't seem overly impressionistic, but because of the subject matter, because of the impact of photography, as you can see in the cropping, because of that emphasis on the modernized, Haussmannized city, it's very much an impressionist painting, even though he doesn't leave globs of paint on the surface, right? Any other comments or questions?
Robin said she was blown away with the money room in Chicago.
That's probably an autocorrect for Monet, right? I'm imagining, yeah. Yeah, Google Arts and
Water
Culture.
lilies.
If you haven't much explored Google Arts and Culture lately, they've made
Yes.
some amazing,
Love that.
yeah, and
Yes,
the
I
art
do.
is one of the best ones that they've got there. Now, if anybody has plans to travel to Kansas City anytime soon, I feel like I should plug that there is a Monet exhibition up at the Nelson Atkins right now. I haven't had a chance to see it yet, but it's sort of, I think it's called Monet and Modernism or something like that. Kansas City has one of these water lily canvases that was part of a triptych. Excellent, Sandy. Let me know, okay? Because maybe we can go and check out some Monet together. But yeah, it's one of a series of a triptych that goes together. They're very rarely exhibited together, and I don't know if they brought them all together for this exhibition or not. But I'm thrilled to go see that.
So when's the next meeting with your class? Next Wednesday?
Is that correct? Do you know,
I
Jennifer?
think, let me look.
I think
at
it's the 6th.
schedule.
I think it's next
Yes,
Wednesday,
it's
the
the
6th.
It
I have
is.
another presentation I'm doing on the 5th, and I'm not keeping straight in my head which is which at this
Yeah,
point
it's
in
the
time.
6th. Next
Okay, fabulous.
day. Yes.
Yeah, so we'll talk about post-impressionism with that one. I'm probably only going to touch on a few artists, but we'll talk about Seurat, who's shown up here, right? So we'll definitely talk about this version of post-impressionism, which will be fun and fabulous too.
That'll be awesome. I'm putting the evaluation in the chat. I've done that a couple of times. I'll continue to just keep plugging that in so you all have access to that. You can also go to your calendar and find that form if you miss it in the chat today.
I will stop screen sharing. Sorry, I forgot I was doing that.
So that's okay.
But as usual, I'm happy to, if you have questions or comments or anything by
Yeah.
email, I'm happy to take those too. I'm just cloud@ucmo.edu. You can find me there. I'll put that in the chat too.
Thanks.
You probably all know how to find me. The internet finds me pretty easily too. So,
Hey,
My dog-
Jasmine, what's your book about?
oh, okay. So, I'm working on this book about the processions that moved through the Roman Forum in the 16th and 17th century. So there are all these. They kind of take on the idea of the ancient Roman triumph, and like they all like want to pretend to be emperors and like march through the ancient triumphal arches. So it's a fun, exciting book that I've been trying to get done for many years, basically since I finished my dissertation. But then I kept having kids, and then we had a global pandemic, and it's going to happen someday, right? Wish me luck. I was supposed to get it done by December 15th, and it's not done, but that's
You can
okay.
do it.
It'll
You
get
can
done.
do it.
Thank you all so much for coming. It's always a delight to see you and such
Gosh, thank you.
friendly faces
you
and
so
good
much
questions.
for sharing your knowledge and expertise and information with us. It's fascinating and
Absolutely.
interesting. And I know our teachers will be able to use that in their
Yeah.
classrooms with their kiddos. So, gosh, appreciate
I
it
don't
so
care
much.
about the
Thank you
kiddos.
all. Huh?
I said I'm more interested in learning than they are. So
No. Yep.
We can find ways to bring a few things in though, right?
actually, I do have some questions for Jennifer, not
Oh, for Jennifer. Okay.
It's like more of this Renaissance type stuff, but I enjoyed your thing. It was good. Very
Yeah,
good.
thank you all so much for coming. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. It's almost Friday. Enjoy the weekend. Miss Sandy, it's gonna be okay. You'll get there. Good luck on the 14th. Thank you,
Hey,
Jasmine. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
stu-
Thank you. Bye-bye.
The student survey stuff, Jennifer.
Yes. Well, I'll see if I can help you.
I've got my test and stuff,
Uh-huh.
and I just